You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, coming in from New York City for actually what may be one of the last times on this show. I am making a move soon to Washington, D.C. But I am delighted to have with me today a special guest to talk through a few issues pertaining to the U.S.-South Korea alliance and South Korean foreign policy and national security more generally. I'm very glad to welcome my friend Carl Friedhoff today, who's joining me from Chicago. He's the Marshall M. Bhutan Fellow for Asia Studies at the Chicago Council. Carl, how's it going today?
Good, Ankit. Thanks you for having me.
My pleasure. So, for listeners who don't know Carl, he's an astute observer of politics on the Korean Peninsula. He spent time living and working in South Korea, works a lot on issues related to the US-ROK alliance, inter-Korean issues, U.S. national security in Northeast Asia. And I'm glad to have him on today because we do have some news, first of all, in the US-ROK alliance context, which is that after several years of what I frankly consider to be unnecessary infighting within the alliance during the Trump administration, President Joe Biden's team very quickly reached a final special measures agreement with South Korea. And for listeners that don't know what that is the agreement that decides what South Korea, or rather the balance of burden sharing for the sustenance of U.S. presence on the Korean Peninsula. So we'll talk through a little bit about what the conclusion of this deal means for the alliance. But more broadly, we're also going to take stock of, we're going to preview a few things. The big preview here is the upcoming visit by U.S. Secretary of State Tony Blinken and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin to not only Korea, but also Japan, but we'll focus mostly on the Korea aspect for today. And then finally, we're actually at an interesting sort of milestone in South Korean President Moon Jae-in's presidency. South Korea has single-term presidencies, and Moon is looking at his final year in office ahead of the elections next year. So just wanted to reflect a bit on, first of all, Moon Jae-in's legacy on the peninsula and his foreign policy, but also what he's hoping to get done over the last year. And Carl, I really can't think of a better guest to have on to talk through all these issues. So really, thanks for taking the time today. So enough for me. Carl, can you tell us a little bit about, first of all, just describe this SMA agreement? What exactly was agreed to between the two sides? And what does it represent for the alliance at this inflection point?
Right. So the final agreement comes down to South Korea doing a 13.9% increase in its past contribution. So it looks like it's going to be about 1 billion US dollars. It includes a 6.5% increase for paying kind of Korean workers who work on the U.S. base. When the agreement failed to be reached in the previous term, they had to furlough something like more than 4,000 workers who work there. So this will help cover them from now on in the future. I think there's a part of that agreement is that there won't be furloughs into the future. This is going to set that aside as well. And the other part is a 7.1% increase in defense spending, or that it's tied to defense spending that will go into the SMA. So now that this is reached, it's going to kind of allow South Korea and the U.S. to start to focus less on internal alliance management and then shift towards external things that they're both focusing on. But one of the interesting parts that came out of this, I thought, was there was an interview from the chief negotiator on the Korean side, and really kind of put the Trump administration a little bit, a subtle subtweet, if it were issued in the form of a tweet, saying that when we arrived at this, we didn't negotiate increases. We looked at what needed to be covered, and that's how we arrived at this number. They said in the past that South Korea was willing to increase 13%. But when I talked to people who were working not as negotiators, but working on the side as this part of this task force to determine what South Korea should contribute, there was broad recognition that South Korea needed to pay more, but it was never going to be $5 billion because their math was, we want to look at what needs to be contributed and what needs to be covered. That will determine our contribution. But the U.S. side under the Trump administration was doing in the reverse, saying, well, we want this much money. How are we going to get to that? And there was no real math add up to that. So the South Koreans, I think, are fairly happy with where it ended up. And I think it looks like a good deal for everyone.
Yeah, so that's the next thing to talk about here. I mean, clearly there was friction within the alliance, whether it appeared in public or not, whether we read about it in the papers or not. There was definitely unease over the way in which the Trump administration was making demands of the South Korean side. You mentioned $5 billion. For listeners, that was the figure. That was the sticker price that the Trump administration was effectively charging the South Koreans. Mm-hmm. The Trump administration, the Biden administration, couldn't have more different visions of what U.S. alliances mean and what they do for American national security. But Carl, I wanted to sort of use this as an opportunity to draw out some of the work I know you've done on public opinion in South Korea. Tell us a little bit about the politics of the US-ROK alliance on the Korean Peninsula now. Conservatives and progressives, of course, have their own different views of the alliance. What have you found over your work over the last few years in terms of how the Trump administration's political approach to the Moon Jae-in government on the SMA has sort of fed into perceptions of the United States as an ally for South Koreans?
Yeah, so there are a couple questions in there, and there are a couple different ways to approach views of the United States. The first is just views of the United States overall. And I think for the first time in a very long time, maybe ever, excluding a short time during the Bush administration in 2002, that net favorable views of the United States turned negative. And so there were more negative views of the United States than favorable views. But now I suspect that that's going to reverse quickly, and we'll go back to seeing favorability of the United States being kind of the top, even when compared to China, North Korea, Japan. Of course, not a tough group to be the top of in that neighborhood for many South Koreans. But there's also views of the alliance. And views of the alliance actually weren't affected by the Trump administration. When we ask about South Koreans if they support or oppose the alliance with the United States, it's still, in the last poll we did, was 90% support. And so and it's been 90 to 95% support for probably ever since I've been doing polling there, which is starting in 2011. So that's been really, really steady. The interesting thing was that there's been a lot of concern that this SMA deal would touch on a lot of sensitive issues for the Korean public, especially the way that the Trump administration was going about it, making this very coercive, saying that if you don't, you have to pay us or else, and then also threatening troop withdrawal at the same time. There's real concern that this would draw kind of on Korean nationalism and lead to this flare up of anti-American sentiment, or at least a downgrading of views of the alliance. But that never really happened. Right? Even when we looked at awareness of the SMA among the public, even though awareness there was something like 66%, so relatively high awareness of it, even people who said they were very aware of it, their views of the alliance didn't really change at all. So this idea that it's maybe a bit scary to say that, well, we can just go around extorting people and it's not going to affect views of the alliance, somewhat dangerous lesson to draw from that, and there's probably a limit to that. The one thing that would have probably affected views of the alliance were if the Trump administration had followed through on threats to withdraw troops from the U.S. Now, I'm not saying that we always have to stick at 28,500 troops. There are certain discussions to be had where partial withdrawal downs can take place. That's been done over time, and usually every 13 to 20 years by my count, and now we're in the 15th year. But it has to be done in a certain way and in coordination. And the Trump administration certainly wasn't thinking about doing that. So any kind of withdrawal like that, especially one that's uncoordinated and unannounced, the data would suggest that that's where we would see a major turn in terms of Korean attitudes on the alliance.
And so, what exactly, insofar as the U.S. is concerned on the Korean Peninsula, what is South Korean public opinion most sensitive to in terms of changes in U.S. policy? My sense was that the change in diplomacy with North Korea between 2017 and 2018 was a big turning point. I mean, certainly for President Moon's approval ratings in South Korea after the Panmunjom summit, for instance. Is that in your view the more kind of salient point for perceptions of the United States on the peninsula?
Yeah, the way that it's going to approach North Korea can be a turning point. But I'd also note that the South Korean public is really pragmatic in terms of North Korea. Yeah. For a lot of us that follow things on the peninsula and follow North Korea more closely, there's kind of this expectation that, well, North Korea is the biggest security threat, therefore the public must be quite sensitive to that. And in reality, it's not all that sensitive. Essentially, if North Korea is blowing things up and killing South Korean soldiers or sinking its ships, the South Korean public prefers a hard line. Right, when Lee Myung-bak had its hard line out on the Lee Myung-bak administration had its hard line on North Korea, public was fairly supportive because of the actions North Korea had done. And when the Park Geun-hye administration came in, I think we ran a question saying, would you like the previous line, like the previous policy on North Korea, would you like it to be even more hard line? And it was something like, it was a majority that said either what it is now or harder, like a more strict line. And so that was in response to North Korean actions. But if North Korea decides that it wants to talk, there are no provocations, there are negotiations ongoing. Of course, the South Korean public would much prefer that. So they want to pursue that. I think the public opinion is going to turn not so much on how the United States is treating North Korea or that. It's mostly how they perceive the United States treating South Korea itself. And so any attempt, or not attempt, but any effort that kind of includes South Korea as a partner and as a full partner and perhaps leading some of those aspects of negotiations is always going to be popular.
Mm-hmm. So let's now change gears a little bit and look forward to the near future. So we're anticipating a trip by U.S. Secretary of State Tony Blinken and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin to South Korea as part of a broader tour of the Indo-Pacific region. Both men will be representing a president who ran very clearly on a platform to put alliances front and center in the way in which the United States conducts its affairs around the world. So I think this visit is going to be closely watched, not only by, folks in East Asia, but, partners in Europe, countries in Southeast Asia. I think will be an important sort of litmus test to see, if the United States is, quote, back, as the Biden administration likes to say. So, we're anticipating an official announcement of the SMA deal during this trip. But what else is on the agenda here? I mean, there's a lot going on. There's continuity, roughly speaking, in U.S.-China relations. We're having a Quad leaders meeting just around the corner. That's probably going to be the topic of a future podcast. So keep, listeners should hopefully keep an eye on the episodes for that. But what else are you going to be looking for out of the Blinken and Austin visits to Seoul?
So on the defense side, I think there's going to be quite a bit of discussion over OPCON transfer, this transfer of wartime operational control. That's something you asked the question at the beginning: what does Moon want to get done in his last year in office? And OPCON transfer is one of the big ones that he wants to get done before he leaves office in, I think, May 2022.
Can you just explain for our listeners what the OPCON transfer issue is? Because it's a little esoteric sometimes, and it's worth just clarifying what it means in practice.
Yeah, so it's basically who's going to control Korean and U.S. troops on the peninsula. Right now, it's basically under U.S. command, so a U.S. commander would be controlling all of the troops there, and this would help transfer it over to a South Korean commander. And of course, the first question is always, well, why would U.S. troops serve under a South Korean commander? And to kind of nip that in the bud, basically U.S. troops have served under foreign commands since, as far as I know, since the Boxer Rebellion, at the turn, like in the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. So it wouldn't be new in terms of that. But to do this, right, it's not any certain litmus test, not on a timeline, but more of a means test. And right now they're behind schedule. So in 2019, they completed the initial operational capability phase of this. In last year, they were supposed to do the full operational capability phase of this, but that got delayed because they couldn't do the exercises that were supposed to be done due to the pandemic. And then the last part of that is full mission capability testing. So both of those things are going to be delayed. So on the defense side, I'm sure the South Koreans are going to be pushing for the U.S. to try to speed that up and find ways to make this happen before the Moon administration leaves office. On the more diplomacy, state-focused side, I think there's going to be a lot of talk, obviously, about China. Trying to harmonize Korea and U.S. policy, because so far I think there's quite a bit of skepticism throughout the U.S. and in the government itself about South Korea's position. And one of the things we often see come up is South Korea is going to tilt towards China, that they may leave the United States alliance and not offer to join China, something that maybe we can discuss later. I'm highly, highly skeptical of that kind of thing taking place. But I think those will be the two headline items. And of course, from the South Korean side in the meetings with Blinken and with Secretary Austin as well, that they'll be pushing on North Korea, right? Mm-hmm. Trying to push the U.S. into doing meetings earlier and at higher levels to try to move that policy along so that Moon can have some sort of accomplishment before his term is up.
Yeah, I mean, something else that I'm going to be watching for. I mean, Tony Blinken has an interesting history in Northeast Asia because when he was deputy secretary of state in the Obama administration, he was the point person for trilateralism, with Japan and South Korea. Held regular meetings with his deputy foreign minister counterparts, and that sort of that ball got dropped during the Trump administration, which also coincided with probably the worst dip in Japan-Korea relations in decades. And so the Biden administration has taken a greater interest in trilateralism. There's already been movement. How do you think that's going to go down in Seoul when Blinken inevitably raises the issue of promoting greater trilateral coordination with Japan? What are the sensitivities there? Because I know the domestic politics of this in South Korea are obviously very touchy for the Moon administration, but you do have pragmatists in South Korea who recognize that South Korea does have a lot to gain from becoming a more friendly trilateral partner, and the Japanese, of course, have to do their own part here. But what do you think that conversation is going to be like for Blinken?
I think it's going to be a little more open than we may be expecting, right? Because we've already seen President Moon come out and say, well, this is in reference to the 2015 agreement on comfort women, even though he spent the early part of his presidency really trying to undermine it and perhaps seemingly withdraw from it. More recently, he said, well, we see that as an agreement between governments and saying it's basically still on the books and still active. I think that was somewhat of an olive branch to say that, yeah, there might be a little flexibility on the part of Korea to revisit that and perhaps push things forward um, in terms of pursuing trilateralism with Japan. But the other part I want to touch on that is the sensitivity around the domestic politics of this. It's something we talk about a lot, and I wish we had a better testing of this because it's talked about so much. But we'll hear people say that anytime that a Korean president is in trouble in terms of favorability ratings or politically, that they'll play the Japan card. In terms of they'll do something to try to blame Japan, to try to shift the focus to Japan. And one of the big troubles for those of us who look at this through the lens of public opinion data is that it never shows up in the data, that there's any benefit at all. Right? I mean, even Lee Myung-bak, I can't remember which year, but he actually landed on Dokdo Island. Right? That's like quite provocative. No other president has done that since, and I don't think anyone did that before. And at the time, we were running daily approval polls, right? So every day we would get new data in on presidential approval. And I think he got maybe a 4 to 5 percentage point bump within I believe it was within the margin of error, and it disappeared within a week. So this idea that there is a Japan card to play and that it is somehow distracting to the public or boosts their popularity. Not saying it's not there, but it's not in the data anyway.
So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about China, which is obviously the elephant in the room in many conversations that Secretary Blinken has been having around the world, and certainly will be in Korea, right? So President Moon, of course, entered office with memories of China's unofficial sanctions campaign over the deployment of the THAAD missile defense system very fresh in the South Korean public's mind, and his new Southern policy has been a very big part of sort of rebalancing South Korea's economic dependency away from China towards Southeast Asia, South Asia more broadly. And you already hinted at this a little bit about this notion that certainly I think is a thing in Washington, where neither of us are based. I will point out to listeners, but this notion that South Korea for some reason is lukewarm about U.S. initiatives to counterbalance China, is somehow going to drift into China's back pocket. So tell us a little bit about, the current state of play in sort of, circles in Seoul where these decisions are discussed and made and, these strategic conversations are happening. How can we expect South Korea to sort of play its cards on China through the Biden years?
You know, we've seen a little bit of this already with South Korea beginning to hint that they're willing to join the Quad and make it the Quad Plus. That's happened recently, and again, that's a new push by the Moon administration to try to pull the U.S. Into advancing probably its interest, South Korean interest on North Korea, right? Giving a little bit to try to get a little bit on that side, but. I think it's a misreading of Korea to say one of the things we often hear is that Japan and South Korea have different perceptions of the threat of China. Again, I'm not so sure that's the case. Now, do they want to handle that threat differently? Absolutely. But I don't think that means that they have totally different perceptions of the threat. South Korea is much more economically vulnerable to the threat of China and its economy because of, I think, something like 15% of South Korean GDP is based on trade with China. That's obviously a huge number. But I think there's going to be a little bit more willingness on the Korean side to engage in this because it wants to make advances on North Korea. Now, is it going to sit down and suddenly like the U.S. would like to for it to clearly choose a side? No, that's not going to happen. But there is, you mentioned this new Southern policy. I think that's a really key part of how the U.S. is going to have to engage and perhaps pursue trilateralism because everyone has these interests in Southeast Asia. Japan's very active there. Korea is getting more active there in terms of business, and the U.S. is, I think, there in the South China Sea, but hopefully moving a little more to focus on the land and the people. So I think that's one point where this trilateralism could come through. The Moon administration is often, in my view, tarred with this label of trying to sell the country either to North Korea or to China. But I'd point out that it's been these progressive presidents that have really focused on building up South Korea's Navy. Right, one of the things that the U.S. is going to need if it's going to come into a more fierce competition is naval assets. And it's not by accident that it's the progressive presidents that are doing that, because that's what happens when you are not going to designate North Korea as your number one enemy. You're not going to focus on land forces. Instead, you're going to redirect your spending towards the Navy. So Roh Moo-hyun and Moon Jae-in, whatever people may disagree with them on, clearly they've spent money on the Navy, and in the long run, that's going to be a benefit to the United States and the alliance as well.
Right. I mean, the 5-year intermediate term national defense plan that the Moon administration put out last year is frankly eye popping when you look at it with any degree of nuance. I mean, it's really a wide ranging modernization plan. This idea that South Korean progressives don't take defense policy seriously is just not true.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
Yeah. I think that might actually be worth a future episode to talk a little bit about that. I often find that South Korea's indigenous defense investments tend to fly under the radar a little bit. We spend a lot of time talking about North Korea. I'm certainly guilty of that. So to close out, we've already sort of hit on some of the themes here, but look, we're recording this podcast on March 11th. South Korea is going to have an election on March 9th, 2022. So 364 full days remain. What's President Moon looking to get done when it comes to foreign policy and national security? We've already hit on the new Southern policy, OPCON transfer, but he's been talking quite a lot about institutionalizing inter-Korean progress, which is 2020 has been, frankly, not a banner year for inter-Korean diplomacy. But what else is on the agenda?
So I think those are actually the big things. There are probably more important or smaller domestic issues. But on the foreign policy side, he's going to want to, kind of formalize these North Korea interactions. I think that will be really tough. And even if he formalizes it, there's always a chance it'll be rolled back or blown up as the North Koreans see fit. OPCON transfer is going to be a tough sell for him. But ultimately, I think he's going to want to try to bring the U.S. on side with the South Korean ability to not choose a side, right? To kind of be this intermediary. And I think if he can get, especially that latter part done, I think that would be a big achievement. Although it's really difficult to judge that achievement because it's going to be so fluid over time.
Mm-hmm. Well, Carl, thanks a lot for joining me today for this was actually a remarkably, we covered quite a lot of ground in very little time. So I really appreciate you joining me and taking the time today.
Thanks for the invitation, Ankit. Great to join you.
Pleasure. Hope to have you back soon. For listeners, if you like the show, but you haven't yet subscribed, please do so you can catch up with future episodes, including an episode on the upcoming Quad Leaders Summit. And finally, if you've been a listener for a while, but you haven't yet left us a review, please do so. It really helps get the word out about the show, and we really do appreciate it. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back very soon with more on the Asia Geopolitics Podcast.